Ancient Egypt was a very interesting and complicated society that left behind a lot of art, building, and knowledge. But by today's standards, some of the rules and habits of ancient Egyptian society may seem shocking and upsetting. The Egyptians had a very different way of life than people do today. They cut off limbs as punishment and sacrificed animals to make the gods happy. In this video, we'll talk about some creepy Egyptian rules that will make you cringe. Mummification and the art of preserving the dead. In ancient Egypt, mummification was an important part of getting the dead ready for the future. The process was hard to understand and took a lot of time. Skilled embalmers, who were usually priests or wealthy people, did it. Keeping the dead alive is something that people today find creepy or macabre, but it was a big part of the religion and culture of the ancient Egyptians. There were many complicated steps in the mummification process, and it could take up to 70 days to finish. First, the body of the dead person was ritually washed and made clean. After that, special hooks were used to carefully remove the brain through the nose. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were then taken out through a cut on the left side of the belly. Each of these organs was kept alive in its own canopic jar, or by being wrapped in linen and put back into the body. Next, a naturally found salt called natron was used to dry out the body. The body was covered with the material for about 40 days, which kept all the moisture out and stopped it from breaking down. After that, the body was carefully cleaned and clothed in oils or cement to protect the skin. Finally, many layers of linen wraps were put around the body. Each layer was put on carefully, and protective charms and amulets were often put between them. Once the bandages were closed, a resin or gum substance was used to make sure the body would stay whole on its trip to the afterlife. Servants buried alive with their masters. One of the scariest things that people did in ancient Egypt was bury their servants alive with their bosses. This upsetting practice, called retainer sacrifice or retainer funeral, was done to make sure the dead had a good life after death. Now, the thought of taking your workers with you into the afterlife may be horrifying to modern ears, but it is important to understand the beliefs and history behind this practice. During Egypt's early dynastic period, from about 3100 to 2686 BCE, retainer killings were most common. As the society developed, they became less common over time. Most of the time, they were seen at the graves of pharaohs, lords, and other important people. The idea that a person's afterlife was like their life on Earth led to the practice. So to make sure the dead had a good time in the next life, their loyal slaves and sometimes their favorite pets were killed and sacrificed to go with them. Multiple human bodies have been found in graves from this time period, which shows that retainer sacrifices were common. The slaves who were sacrificed were usually poisoned or killed in other ways that didn't hurt their bodies too much, because keeping their bodies in good shape was important for the afterlife. But as time went on, the ancient Egyptians began to change how they thought about offerings of retainers. Small figures called shabtis or ushabtis started to be put in tombs instead of the practice. These figures, which were carved from stone, wood, or faience, were meant to magically replace the servants who had died. They had spells written on them that would bring them back to life in the future to do work for the dead. Sacred animal cults and ritual sacrifices. The Egyptians were known for having a strong respect for animals because they were important to their religion and culture. All over Egypt, people had cults that were committed to certain animals that they thought possessed the qualities of certain gods or goddesses. Animals of all kinds were worshipped by these groups, from big, dangerous animals like crocodiles and lions to smaller, more common animals like cats and birds. Some parts of these groups may be disturbing to modern people, but learning about the religious and cultural meanings behind these practices can help us understand how the ancient Egyptians thought. A lot of these cults were based around buildings that were dedicated to certain gods. People would respect these animals with sacrifices and rituals because they were often seen as manifestations or symbols of the gods they stood for. For instance, the Apis bull was linked to the god Ptah, who was worshipped in Memphis. In Crocodilopolis, the crocodile god was honored. In ancient Egypt, ritual killings of animals were an important part of animal cults. Animals that were going to be offered to the gods were carefully picked out and raised. People thought that this would make the gods happy, protect them, and make the people rich. Before they were killed, the animals were often decorated with gold or other valuable items. They were also treated with great respect and ritually cleansed. When an animal was killed as an offering, its body was usually mummified and buried in a holy cemetery. A lot of these preserved animals have been found at these burial sites, which shows how big and important these ceremonies were in ancient Egyptian society. The use of human body parts in medicinal practices. Egyptian medicine was an interesting mix of magic, science, and religious ideas. In this time, healers and doctors were thought to have a lot of knowledge and skill. Often complicated practices and the use of different medicines were part of their treatment. For modern people, this may seem gross or upsetting because the ingredients included human body parts. But to understand the cultural background of ancient Egyptian medicine, it's important to look into why people did the things they did. The doctors of ancient Egypt thought that the human body had great healing powers. People in many old cultures believed in sympathetic magic, which is where the use of body parts in medicine gets its background. People thought that using body parts from dead people as medicine could give those properties to live people, especially body parts from people who had special skills or traits in life. In a lot of different methods, different kinds of human tissues, bones, and fluids were used. People thought that skull pieces or bone powder could help treat problems with the head. People used human fat to make ointments and balms that were used to heal cuts and skin problems. People thought that mummies had powerful healing energy, so they ground them up into a powder that was then added to medicines to treat a wide range of illnesses. Some people today think it's gross that ancient Egyptians used human body parts in medicine, but they really believe that these methods worked. At the time, they didn't know much about the human body or diseases, but they tried to fix illnesses with the tools and information they had available. Execration rituals. Curses were very powerful and played a big part in everyday life. Cursing and symbolically destroying one's enemies as part of excommunication traditions was a common way to keep evil away and keep people alive from harm. Cursing may seem scary and dark to people today, but learning about how these rituals worked in ancient Egyptian society can help us understand their religious and cultural views at the time. Rituals of exorcism were an important part of ancient Egyptian magic that was used for many things. They could be used to keep people or groups safe from bad people, to weaken or beat an enemy in battle, or to keep society in order by punishing people who break the rules. People of all social classes believed in the power of curses, as shown by the fact that these practices were carried out by priests, magicians, and even regular people. As part of the process of execration, actual representations of the people who were to be killed were made. These were usually clay or wax figurines, pottery shards with writing on them, or papyrus scrolls. On these things, the names or pictures of the enemies or evil forces would be written, along with magical spells or incantations. They then did different harmful things to the objects, like smashing, stabbing, burning, or burying them. These acts show that the enemies have been destroyed and their harmful intentions have been canceled out. Inscriptions called execration texts, which list the names of the people who were meant to be killed, tell us a lot about the political, social, and religious life of ancient Egypt. They showed what people were worried about and scared about, as well as the relationships and fights that shaped the area. The pharaoh's marriage to their siblings. Incestuous marriages, especially between pharaohs and their brothers, were a common thing in ancient Egyptian society that might seem very strange to people today. But these marriages were important to the religion, politics, and society of the time, and they served specific goals in the complicated world of ancient Egypt. It is important to look at the cultural and moral reasons behind these relationships in order to understand why they were seen as okay and even necessary. People in ancient Egypt thought that pharaohs were gods, or godlike people who came from the gods themselves. They were seen as the earthly embodiment of divine power, and it was their job to keep the world in balance, which was called Ma'at. As a way to keep their bloodline pure and make sure that their children would receive their divine status, they married their siblings, who were also thought to be divine. Pharaohs married off their siblings for political reasons as well. It helped to keep the royal family together, strengthen ties, and stop power struggles. Since they were related, siblings who got married were supposed to be loyal to the crown, which reduced the chance of betrayal or rebellion. This helped keep the royal line alive and keep the power system stable and centralized. Ancient Egyptian beliefs and cultural norms played a big role in making these marriages between family members okay. In many Egyptian myths and religious writings, there were pairs of gods who were siblings, like Isis and Osiris. They were important figures in the Egyptian pantheon. By trying to be like these gods, the pharaohs tried to prove that they were gods and that their rule was right. Cannibalism, myth or reality? Historians and researchers have talked a lot about and made guesses about the practice of cannibalism in ancient Egypt. While some accounts say that cannibalism happened, it's still not clear if these events were one-time occurrences or part of a larger cultural custom. We modern people find the thought of cannibalism very disturbing and gross, but it's important to look at the evidence and cultural background to get a better sense of what life was really like in ancient Egypt. Several texts from that time, like the pyramid texts, have parts that seem to refer to eating. In particular, the so-called cannibal hymn found in the tomb of Pharaoh Unas talks about how the king ate God's bodies to get their divine powers. Most scholars agree, though, that these writings should not be taken literally when they talk about cannibalism. Instead, they should be understood as metaphors. They are more of a symbol of the desire for power and endless life than a real practice of eating people. But there is also some limited physical evidence that may point to cannibalism happening in Egypt in the past. Some places have found human remains that show signs of having been butchered or defleshed, which could mean that people were eating each other. But the proof isn't strong enough to say for sure, and it's hard to tell if these results are the result of one-off events, rituals, or the effects of famine or other extreme conditions. Dream interpretation and supernatural omens. Dream analysis and the belief in supernatural signs were important parts of ancient Egyptian culture. They showed how deeply religious the people were and how much they wanted to understand the world around them. Some people today might think these practices are strange or mystical, but for the ancient Egyptians, they were very important to their daily lives and affected how they made choices and behaved in many ways. People thought that dreams were a way for the gods to talk to people, and they often gave people useful information, predictions, or warnings about the future. As a result, dream analysis became an important skill that people from all walks of life, including pharaohs, priests, and regular people, wanted to learn. Dream interpreters were trained to look at the images and symbols in dreams and give help and direction based on what they saw. A lot of old Egyptian writings, like the Chester Beatty Papyrus, record dreams and how they were interpreted. These records can tell you a lot about what people believed and what worried them. People thought that dreams could tell them about many things, such as their health, their relationships, politics, and even their faith life. The ancient Egyptians also put a lot of stock in omens and other mysterious signs, along with dreams. People often thought that the movement of celestial bodies, strange weather patterns, or strange animal behavior were signs of God's will or things that were about to happen. Priests and other knowledgeable people carefully watched and interpreted these signs, which helped them make choices about farming, war, and religious rituals. Magic and amulets. In ancient Egypt, magic was an important part of everyday life. It affected everything from religion and medicine to relationships and politics. A large part of the people believed in magic and thought it could protect, heal, and make things better. A lot of people believed in this and used amulets, which they thought could use magic to change the real world and the afterlife. Amulets were small, often very carefully designed items made from stone, clay, metal, glass, and other materials. They came in many different shapes and sizes and were often thought to reflect gods, goddesses, animals, or abstract symbols. Each one was thought to have its own special powers to protect or help. For instance, the Eye of Horus amulet was thought to protect and heal, and the Jed pillar stood for strength and security. People from all walks of life in ancient Egypt wore or carried these amulets to bring good luck, keep away bad spirits, or deal with specific problems like health problems or safety during childbirth. Some people also hid amulets inside the wrappings of mummies or buried them with their bodies to protect them and help them in the future. Making amulets was a very skilled job that often required a lot of knowledge about art materials, methods, and religious meanings. Artists recited prayers or spells while making the amulets to give them the powers they were supposed to have. The process of making them was also magical. Funerary texts. In ancient Egyptian religion and society, the afterlife was very important, and funerary texts were an important part of the elaborate preparations made for the journey after death. These writings, which were often found on tomb walls, papyrus papers, and other funeral items, were meant to help and protect the dead as they moved through the complicated and sometimes dangerous afterlife. For modern readers, the idea of detailed directions for the afterlife may seem strange, but these texts tell us a lot about what Egyptians believed and what they were worried about. The pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead are some of the different types of funeral texts that were used in ancient Egypt. There were spells, prayers, and practices in these books that were meant to help the dead get through different problems they might face in the afterlife. Problems were talked about in these writings, like the journey through the underworld or the judgment before the god Osiris, where the heart of the dead would be weighed against the feather of truth. Often, these spells in the funeral texts were very detailed and dealt with personal issues or possible dangers. Spells could, for example, make sure that the dead had food and drink, keep them safe from evil spirits, or let them change into different animals to help them on their way. The texts also told the dead what they should do and how they should behave in order to get along with the gods and get a place in the endless paradise. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.